Hello, guys. So this is the other webinar that we are kicking off, and today we have our guests, Basem Al-Sabri and Mark Coleman. Basem represents NetOmate company, and Mark Coleman, NetBox Labs. So today we're gonna talk about the single source of truth, the best practices for managing your network. But actually, I got very big comment and red flag from both of our guests that actually I can't name our webinar as a single source of truth. It should be a source of truth. So we're definitely gonna cover why is that. And well, let's kick off on the couple of things where we are today. So, based on Gartner's report, there are still more than 70% of networks that are completely manual. A lot of network administrators, NetOps, are basically the ClickOps. And today we want to uncover what are the reasons behind why we are lagging on the network automation. What are the real reasons why we can't automate them? And I would like to start from Mark. And perhaps you could firstly tell us why it's not single source of truth.
Sure thing. Yeah, thanks for giving me that. So I think single source of truth was an idea from a few years ago where people thought that they could use something like NetBox and put all of their data in there and then magically they would be in control. But what we actually see in reality is that there are many sources of truth in a network. There are many different systems that are being updated at different times by different people, sometimes in different silos, sometimes automatically. And really, the task is to be able to be in control of all of them, not necessarily that all of them should be pushed to a single tool. So I'll give you a specific example. Often, people like to put what we call L1 through L3 information into NetBox. So you could have like physical devices, cables, IPs, VLANs, and all sorts of stuff like that. But many of our customers and open source users also have other things in their networks, like perhaps they're using Juniper Mist for Wi-Fi control, or perhaps they have a whole bunch of virtualization that's running through VMware, vCenter, or perhaps they are using Cisco Catalyst Center for something. Now, normally there's a good reason for why they're doing this. Either they need those tools to manage that part of their infrastructure in those ways. Sometimes there are less good reasons for this. There could be kind of silos and people wanting to protect their part of the company. But whatever reason it is, these systems are being updated with important infrastructure information all the time. And the idea that we're just going to take all of that and put it into NetBox and then push it all out to the network all the time is not realistic, right? Like really what we see people doing is saying, okay, some of our information is going to be in NetBox, and maybe that grows over time. Some of it will live in vCenter. Some of it stays in Mist because they have a nice UI that our Wi-Fi team like, or some other reason like this. Then the question becomes not how do I have a single source of truth, but how do I stay in control of all of these places where data is being generated?
Right. So from now on, we should name our webinar Source of Truth.
Or, well, people say source of truth, but they also say network source of truth sometimes, which I think is also fine.
True.
Yeah. But not
True.
single.
So, Basem, what are the practical pillars on data modeling and how, the companies should start evaluating on getting started the automation of their networks?
Yeah, so in terms of like data modeling, I would say that comes a bit later in the journey of network automation. We always like find that the best way for new companies to start with automation is like start with really the smaller tasks. So you pick like a pain point that the company is experiencing, and then you just like try to solve that without having to worry about like the bigger things that you need for automation. You don't have to worry about like the if you're coming from networking, you don't have to worry about version control. You don't worry about CI/CD. So you try to just like pick and get the quickest one as you can, build momentum, build confidence, and then you go from there. In terms of like data modeling, what I found is like, so there is open config AI models that are like a good source to kind of like browse through, but they can be a bit extensive and can be like overwhelming for someone, let's say, coming from networking and taking a look. What I found like in terms of like data modeling, a good way to start is actually by looking at your config, and then you work back from there. Usually you can see that the config is kind of like modular in a sense. So if you strip away all the commands and then just like to the sources, that kind of like gives you a good idea of what your data model should look like.
Right. So digging deeper a little from like, we kind of evaluated all the pain points, as you say. But for example, how, because in many cases, what most of the engineers are lacking is courage. And for in that case, we have the documentation, we have those pain points. What should be like the starting point, Mark, on those data-driven networks? Because you also mentioned, there are like, VMware tools, you have, let's say, NetBox, etc., etc. So how you can get, all those merged together?
Yeah, I think, well, you mentioned courage. I think that's a good point. And like we see a lot of the same patterns here that we saw in previous movements, right? So if we were to get in a time machine and go back to 2012, we could have exactly the same conversation about like, why isn't everybody doing DevOps yet? Now, DevOps had some real advantages, I would say, because we were typically concentrated a little bit further up the stack, which meant that for a lot of like doing things safely, we could use like virtual machines, or later we could use containers to split things up and test things out quickly. It's a lot harder to do something like that on a core router, right? So like the domain is slightly different, even though a lot of the patterns are very similar. I agree with what Basem said about starting small, but it's important to start small and also start on an important problem. Like we speak to customers all the time that have gone ahead and they've huge organization. One team has done some automation, they've made some gains, but they haven't been able to join it up to anything that's important for the rest of the company. And this can be really tricky sometimes. Like I mentioned before, you can have data silos where maybe the DSIM team, like the data center team, is using one tool.
Mhm.
They really like their data model and they're not going to change it. And then you're trying to do automation and you like your data model and you're not going to change it, right? And there's a lot of kind of human getting on board and working together that needs to happen here. And the only way to really do that is to pick a problem that's important enough to solve, or like pick a pain that's really hurting. I think the other thing that's important here is that if we use the DevOps analogy again, like still today, not everybody is doing all of the things that the fanciest DevOps people are doing, and that's probably fine, right? Like not everybody needs to automate, but I think what the data shows us is that probably, some of those 70% have work still to be done.
So right now we're kind of talking about the principles and how to get started. But, when, let's say, a small team starts to kind of identify those pain points, starting, from the small steps to adopt that SOT and whatnot, what would be then, from your practical standpoint, Basem, what would be the next steps for them to kind of governance and kind of, articulate the trust within the whole company? Because what we notice from our customer base that in many cases, you have the network guys and you have, C-suite, and they are disconnected. They are completely disconnected because one end talks the Excel spreadsheet, the other end talks about, profitability, ROI, and whatnot. So Basem, could you chip in a little on understanding and giving some, kind of advice for those guys who actually are deeply involved and want to get the SOT in place, how we can engage with the whole company.
Yeah, I think like in that you even find that problem even with not even, let's say, between engineers and the C-suite, but you also find it with different, let's say, if a company is large enough and you have different networking teams, or let's say tooling teams and network engineering teams, like everyone have their own objectives, and sometimes the objectives are not aligned. So I think one important thing is kind of like to learn to speak the language of the other teams, and to kind of like really try to look for the common wins or the win-win situations that can take both teams. I think that's really sometimes the issue, is like just like speaking past each other as teams, and that really just drags or kind of like slows the conversation. In terms of between network engineers and the C-suite is having the engineers tying like the projects that they have to business outcomes. That's how kind of like you can get like the buy-in from the C-suite, and then from the C-suite is actually to listen actually to kind of like the pain points that engineers do, because sometimes some of the tooling is actually being chosen by management, like without to say with minimal involvement from the engineers on the ground.
You see, I took this analogy of network guys and C-suite because that was like, really a good example how, you have the same company, but people talk with completely different language. And the reason for that, because when you look at how companies, networks are evolving, you can actually see that, in most of the cases, we are driven by the business decisions, And what we must understand that a very good example was French telco was about or was planning to kind of adopt, IPv6. And, what is the actual ROI for running the dual stack? It's, very kind of questionable decision to make, right? If you have, let's say, enough IPv4 addresses, you have to make sure, because you have the other additional sources that you will have to control, the dual stack, the licensing, the end user routers, and whatnot, right? So these are the things that we should definitely take into consideration. But looking and moving a little bit deeper, what would you say? And this is the question for you both. What would you say the biggest challenge is? It's DNS? Is it IPAM? Is it the orchestration or monitoring systems? What basically the main obstacle for getting things right?
You want to go first, Basem?
I'll let you take that one.
Yeah, okay. It's a hard one because it depends on the company. I mean, we have like a prescribed way that we see people doing this, which we call the 4 Cs, which is coverage, confidence, cohesion, control. Coverage is like, how much of the infrastructure can I actually see, right? And when we say see, we don't necessarily mean like in spreadsheets that might be out of date or in a wiki or in somebody's head, right? Like it's somewhere, like it's in NetBox, I can see it, or it's synced from some other system and I can actually view it. But then the second one is confidence, which is, like if you deploy NetBox, your first problem is that it's empty. And that's why we have NetBox Discovery and NetBox Assurance and everything else. But as soon as it's full, your second problem is that the data is now out of date, right? Like if you get it all up to date and then tomorrow somebody changes something, it's not up to date anymore. So that's what we call confidence. It's like, how am I clear on the data that I'm looking at? How do I know whether or not it's up to date? How do I have that? Next, we talk about cohesion, which you talked about with monitoring and DNS and other things. Cohesion means, okay, let's say NetBox is up to date, but is it in sync? Like, we speak to lots of people who will update things in NetBox and then use that to drive, config generation or something like that. But a separate team maintains their own data for monitoring, right? So sometimes you'll make a change in NetBox and push something out, and then you have to send a ticket to the monitoring team to update the monitoring that that's out of date. So now you're getting false alerts. And this applies for config backups and DNS and all sorts of other things. And on our path, the last one is control, which is then actually pushing things out to the network. So for me, it doesn't map so cleanly what I see to sort of specific areas like IPAM or DNS or something like that. And it's more complicated than that too, because a lot of people, we have a lot of very large sort of like AI data center provider customers coming on board now. And some of the problems that they face at scale would not be what we would typically call automation, but it's still an automation task, which is, if I'm deploying entire aisles of new equipment every week, how am I making sure that I can generate updated cable cut sheets for my data center engineers? How am I making sure that I can check the bill of materials for things that arrive, so that when they arrive, they're actually accurate against the source of truth? So it's all the way from, we tend to look at the life cycle as a little bit longer, from ordering the equipment to it landing in a loading dock, to it being correctly racked in the data center or in your premises. And then we go up the stack to, how is this thing configured? And I would say, depending on the company, people have problems in all sorts of places across that entire life cycle where automation could help. The other thing that we see, which may or may not be interesting, is, you referred earlier to legacy IPAM tools, but we actually see some very successful customers who have a source of truth like NetBox, but for organizational or some other reasons still use a more traditional IPAM tool. That can be fine, as long as you're in control of, like, making sure that the data is synchronized.
Right. What's your take, Basem, on this?
Yeah. So when talking about like the things that you store in the source of truth, I think the most common resource is IP addresses. I see, like, from a like repetition, it's like the most common like used resource. That's the one that like generally tends to take most of the time. And one thing that like Mark touched upon is like, keeping the data consistent. Let's say you got into a stage in which you have your data in your source of truth, is like, how do you keep that up to date? So for example, you take an example, if you're submitting your cut sheets, your cabling plans, and let's say you've done a good job of having that in your source of truth, and for example, that was sent for rework. That happens almost all the time. That was how do you then make sure that that's reflected back? So it comes like back to having like closed loops to make sure that like these edge cases are kind of like captured, and you're having tooling that kind of like auto corrects or auto updates with time.
Is it really safe to say that you could rely on the systems that could do auto discovery, auto correct, and all those bits and pieces, Mark?
It depends on the systems. I mean, so NetBox Discovery has 3 modes. Network discovery, which is like, go find the active IPs in the network. Device discovery, which is connect to traditional devices like routers, switches, etc., and ask them what their current state is. And then the third one is controller discovery, which is connect to parts of your infrastructure that are managed through their own APIs. So that would be vCenter, Mist, Cisco Catalyst Center, etc. You can also take NetBox Discovery and take it a step further and build your own inputs for that. So people do that because often they find themselves in a situation where maybe their networking team is actually quite advanced, but their vendors insist on sending them spreadsheets for new equipment that's turned up. So we need a way to be able to read those spreadsheets and get them in. I think there's always 2 phases here which people have got to kind of keep in mind. The first one is like initial discovery, and then the second one is what we call kind of deviations or reconciliation, right? So I may have discovered advice for the first time and I know everything that's in there now. But then if somebody SSHs into that device and changes something, I also want to be able to know that there's now a deviation between what I think is in the network and what's actually in the network. And this is really where, to Basem's point earlier, data modeling becomes more important, because really what you're doing when you're synchronizing these different data sources is you're making decisions about how to do that synchronization, right? You may be making a decision to say, okay, if the vCenter API tells me that the VM has this status, what does that status get mapped to in NetBox, for example? Right? And all of these decisions are important because people need to use the information and understand it.
And to kind of add to your point, we talk right now about the actual network and appliances, what you can discover in the network. But what we also notice that a lot of those networks that actually have, allocated IP addresses, they quite often forget to actually start their journey from their original IP allocations. And what that means that, if you have the LRI, the IP addresses, the tools inside of a network, you would only be able to see the IP addresses that are like announced by the human, but eventually you have to start your journey from the LRI so that you would understand what's your allocation. And a very good example was from our experience when actually large telco's strategy over the last 15 years was to acquire the other telcos. And, they came up to so many LRIs, they came up to so many legacy systems that they basically had to, make a new department that would merge all those tools, all those assets into one harmonized system. So that's also one of the things that networks have to pay attention to the point when it's economically sustainable. Should we also consider the open source option? Basem.
That's generally the way we start. It's kind of like an easier conversation to kind of like start projects with open source when like there is no like financial commitment from the clients. And so yeah, that's definitely like the way to, or at least like our preferred way of doing things. We start with open source, and then if you see that there are any features or you need like more support, then like you expand from that.
What's your take, Mark? And I know that you, Mark, would say yes, NetBox has an open source version.
Well, no, I mean, look, I've been in technology for longer than NetBox, but in general, I agree with Basem. Like from the user's perspective, and also from our perspective as the vendor, we want people to be able to experiment as quickly as possible. That's the main thing, because at first you're trying to learn, right? Like, is this even for me? And if to learn, you have to speak to sales and then have calls and then see demos and everything else. Maybe for some people that's what they want, but for most people in my circles, they don't want to speak to anybody. They want to download it and they want to start experimenting. And that's why open source is great, right? And we see this all over the place. I mean, before I was doing NetBox, I was very involved in the Kubernetes ecosystem. We see the same thing there. Generally, like, open source is very powerful in how people are adopting technology today. And we see that from a sales side at NetBox Labs, where about 50% of the people that come in and become customers were previously using NetBox open source, and the other 50% just come straight in as customers. So it's very important. But the thing to be aware of is that if you're going to go and assemble a whole bunch of open source tools to solve your goals, then you need the skills and the time and the support to do that, right? So it's a trade-off.
And this was actually my next question about the experience. because then you've been doing most of your life ClickOpsing and working on a manual network. What would you say experience is essential? And by the way, a big topic is AI. Is it also kind of a helping tool for gaining the experience or coordinating the things for your network, having enough of experience? What would be your take, Basem?
I think the most important trait now would be like adaptability, and I think this would touch on one of the points we discussed earlier about what's stopping network automation. And I think one of those is the fact that, like, let's say many experienced network engineers have so much experience with the CLI, with the command line, that now that they have to kind of like let go of that and have to adopt a new skill, whether that's working with automation tools or having to kind of like write code themselves. It's kind of like a bit of a hard transition to make. So I think, yeah, adaptability is definitely the main thing, and even more so now with AI. It was the case with automation, and now with AI, the cycle is even quicker.
I'll add to that on the AI point. Well, actually, on both. I think on the skills side, I like the adaptability. I'd throw curiosity in there too. I think there's a lot of conversations going on about, like, do network engineers have to code, and will coders have to network engineer? And I think it's the wrong conversation. We can look at like previous shifts, like that. If your approach to network automation requires that you have people who are experts in programming and network engineering, then you're going to have a very hard life, because there just aren't very many of those people. But I do think that both sides need to get curious about the other side, because at some point they're going to start working together. And it's a lot easier as a software engineer, if you know what a VLAN is, to start with, than if you have kind of no idea about networking. And it's the same on the network engineering side. If you know a little bit about version control, a little bit about Git, maybe do some research on how CI/CD pipelines work and why they're necessary. That'll just help these conversations to be much better. And I think that's where AI is really useful. We use a ton of AI. I use it all the time in my role as the product manager for NetBox, because very often I'll get someone with a very specific use case about a type of cable for modeling a thing in a type of data sense that I don't know anything about, has a bug or a feature request. And with AI, I can get up to speed pretty quickly so that I can have a conversation with them that makes sense. I think we can use AI in the same way, so we can talk to our colleagues, even though we don't necessarily have all of the skills to kind of do everything we need for automation.
Makes sense. So where do you see the SOT role would evolve? I mean, where are we heading to? Is it more like orchestrating a multiple applications and control planes? Or are we kind of moving into some sort of single system that would be, a sort of controller of the different domains? And my point here is, I can give you an example. In today's world, we have basically the API driven environment. Everyone can talk with API, right? So perhaps you don't need to kind of develop an elephant to kind of get to the end result. Instead, perhaps, we could be more sustainable, connecting, those different APIs, using some sort of a middleware and whatnot, or even perhaps the AI layer, that would communicate within those APIs. So the essential part here is to understand where the technology is heading to. What do you see, Basem?
I think we'll still have like Mark mentioned, you have your source of truth or source of truths for your different resources. I think AI is just going to speed up like the build process. I don't think so you hear like a lot of hype around agentic, and I use AI a lot in kind of like almost everything that I do, from whether it's like coding or researching like new topics. But in terms of agentic, it's not quite there yet to trust it with, I suppose, with your environments. But it does a good job of shaving time of like kind of like what you're doing. So like the build process becomes a bit quicker. It's easier to produce code as compared to before, but I don't think it will like completely eradicate what's being what's already there. And I think it's like the more deterministic, let's say, workflows you have, you put AI on top of that, then you actually get like a much better result than just like ripping everything apart.
Mark, what would be your take?
Yeah, I agree with that on the AI side. I mean, we're seeing it as a massive accelerator here, and I think everybody goes through a similar kind of process when they're using it themselves, which tells us something about how we can use it in the future for automated workflows. I mean, most people I know found ChatGPT, started talking to it, got sick of copying and pasting things into their IDE, got Cursor, then they did Cursor for a while. Then they got sick of talking to it. So they moved to Claude Code, and now they have agents doing things. But then they have a whole bunch of other problems, which is, do I have unit tests to make sure that it's correct? Did I create my specs correctly, right? So we're seeing it change all the time. If you apply that personal AI adventure to, I think what we're going to see in like AI ops, right, which people have been talking about for a long time. I think to Basem's point, we're still at what a lot of people call the augment stage. I'll give you an example. It's not exactly network automation, but I think it's like a relatable example, which is with NetBox, we get a lot of issues coming in, right? So on the GitHub, so we'll get feature requests and we'll get bugs. One of our engineers did an experiment to see if when a bug comes in, we could hand it to an LLM and have it propose a PR, right? And what we found is that for like very small things, you were like, wow. And for bigger things, it would solve it, but would it solve it in a way where we're like, you know, you can't change half of the code base to solve this problem, right? So we ended up not going to full automation. And instead, I don't know if we're still running it or not, but sometimes just looking at what it thinks the solution is useful. But ultimately, you've got a human that's looking at that. If we apply that to AI ops, one of the patterns that we're seeing is that now that so if you imagine that same sort of like human doing it, human augmented, and then fully automated kind of step, NetBox Assurance will find differences between NetBox and what's in the network. So let's just say that like in NetBox, it interfaces up, and we find out that in the network, it's down. Now, today, we just expose that to the user, and then you can find out like maybe it's supposed to be down and I should update NetBox, or maybe somebody did something in the network and NetBox is correct. You could imagine, and what we're working on is being able to take more of the data that we have so that the AI can make a suggestion about what happened here. Like who actually logged into that device recently? Who was the person who was responsible for this? Why did they do it? Is it attached to some kind of change ticket? But still presenting information to the user so that the user can make a more informed decision, like this augmented step. I think to go another step and say, and then the AI SSHs to a device and like puts the interface back up. I don't know, maybe for like bouncing interfaces or something, or changing an interface description. But from like, if you're going to start touching like routing, I think it's going to take a while before people have confidence with that. Because to the point earlier, like people don't even trust people to do automation right now. So it might take a little bit longer before we trust the robots.
So what I hear from you guys, that AI is a kind of promising thing
I would say
to
it's already
exercise.
hugely valuable. It's just not what people think it might be yet, which is, you know, the AIs are just running the network. I think that's a bit further.
Is it, do you think that people don't have a concept or structure how to properly automate the AI, or it's still in its early development and you have too many hallucinations that you can't rely on AI?
I think that hallucinations remain an issue to some extent, but I think the broader problem is to ask the question, like you've got artificial intelligence, and then you've got like what we just call intelligence, which is humans, right? How do you check that a human did something right? you don't, right? You trust them, or maybe you've got some tests or something like that. Like,
But
until
it couldn't be, humans, are wrong too.
well, that's exactly right. So, and like the way we solve this in software is we say we don't trust the humans to go and retest every regression every time we do a commit. We have a whole bunch of tests that go and check that. Now, a lot of teams on the networking side are not yet there, right? They, even if a human makes a change, they can't automatically check that the human was correct. So until they get to that point, it's going to be hard for them to automatically check that an AI is correct.
I was gonna say, like, that's why we have like the peer review process, which is generally more from a coding perspective, but it also happens in when like in networking when we're applying changes, you always go through change review meetings, and that's kind of like our way of making sure that like humans are actually doing the right thing and like there are no typos that would bring the network.
We touched AI, we touched the API world and whatnot. What do you see? What are the biggest gaps right now in the ecosystem for like harmonizing the networks and making them automated? Basem.
I think the main thing, or one of the main things that's stopping network automation is awareness. I think what most organizations think about network automation is the tooling that they get from the vendor, but they don't realize that there is so much that can be done like beyond that, like simple scripting that can just really like save hours, or introducing safety checks and automated testing that improves things. So I think that's kind of like one of the main things is just the lack of imagination or the lack of awareness in terms of like what the possibility is.
Yeah, Mark.
I agree. I agree with that. I think it's very tempting. This actually goes back to the first part of your other question of Vincentas, which was about like, do we think sources of truth are going to have orchestrators built into them and all sorts of stuff like that? I think definitely for traditional network buyers, there's been a temptation to try and buy everything from the vendor, right? So like I get my equipment and they also have this thing for automation, so I'll buy that. And they also have this thing for monitoring, so I'll buy that. And that, like obviously that's appealing because you say, oh, I just trust one vendor and they sell me everything. But I think a couple of things have happened. One is when you sort of buy everything from a single vendor, you then find out that you're sort of in competition with all the other customers of that vendor for features that you want, right? So if you're the biggest customer, that's great. But if you're not, that might not be so good. That's one of the reasons why, I think when Docker first launched, they had this idea of batteries included but replaceable, right? Like it did networking, it did a bit of storage, but you could bring your own drivers. We call it our big tent philosophy, which is we try to work with as many other tools as possible. We have options for discovery, but we also integrate with like 4 other discovery things, right? We have options for various things and we try and plug in everywhere else. And I think to Basem's point, Basem described it as imagination. I think that's probably a good way of putting it. Like there are other ways to do these things right now, but it is a trade-off because it's very tempting to just go and buy everything from one vendor and then be done. And in some cases that might be okay. I think the other problem is standardization. So we have this problem a lot less in like my previous life in like the Kubernetes world, although arguably still some issues there. But we talked about open config earlier. Even simple things like test environments. Like if I want to use Container Lab, for example, to spin up a test lab to try out some stuff, if I want to use SR Linux, that's great because it's there. Arista is, you've got to sign up, but then you can download it. But now if I want to start testing Cisco devices, I've got to start building Docker images and doing all sorts of stuff. There's a lot of things that we just take for granted in the software world that make our lives a lot easier that you can't do in the networking world. And I think if the vendors were to understand that we're not all becoming developers, but we're starting to behave like developers and give us the tools that we need, it'd make it a lot easier. And then please, agree on some standards around some things. That would be kind of useful.
I agree with you that, even if you are managing quiz data, the registries don't have the same quiz registry, structure, but they all IPs, they're all the same, right? But, assigning to different regions, they kind of turned into a completely different thing at some point. So standardization is definitely a case here. And how far are we off the standardization, Basem?
Yeah, I don't think we're super close, but I think there are like a few advancements that have been made. So the open config is one of them, I suppose. That brings like a common language, and I think that's going to be like a key thing. Like now that people are talking about data models, the conversation is out there in the open, and organizations are starting to adopt that. So I think that should probably like bring more unity, but also to touch on Mark's point, I think I'm not sure if, like from the vendor's perspective, I don't see what like if everything is kind of like tied to incentives. I don't know what the incentive would be for the vendors actually, because there is like effort to actually collaborate and standardize. So I think that it's just going to depend on what incentive they see in that.
So what happened to those, pretty RFCs in internet world? My ultimate question is: are they not developed too slow? Are we not looking into something that is really, let's test 100 times and then release it to prod? But perhaps in today's ecosystem, when the things are moving too fast, shouldn't we really follow some sort of RFCs, or are they even relevant, Mark?
I mean, so obviously the internet is pretty impressive, right? So RFCs have done some good work, and still today, like an IP is an IP, like OSPF is pretty much OSPF, right? Like there is a lot of standardization in networks. I think the trouble there, and this comes from my experience with the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, right? The Kubernetes guys. We kind of had an unwritten motto, which was working code over standards. And I think this helps a lot. We already see some of this working in the automation space. I'll use Container Lab again. Like, we could have sat down or gone to the IETF and spoke about like what do we need for like device modeling, but instead Nokia just built it, and now everyone uses that, right? That is the standard. And the good thing about that is that we know the standard works because we did the using it first, right? We let the kind of standard emerge. Now, admittedly, you had to have Docker before that, but nobody wrote an RFC for Docker either, right? So I think this shift towards letting the technology speak for itself is an interesting counterpoint to sitting down and writing standards, because standards can be reinterpreted in many ways, as we see, whereas working software just gets adopted and then it is the standard.
Exactly.
So there's something in there.
I agree 100% on that, and it's a good example. I always use it. It's a really classic one. Everyone in that early 2000s were having racks of servers. Everyone were running the infrastructure by themselves and whatnot. But in 2014, AWS came and said, "Hey guys, you can use our cloud services. It's more convenient for you. You don't need to worry about maintaining the whole bare metal and whatnot." And it became standard. But DevOps is now cool, but network admins, it's not cool anymore. That's why we are talking about it, to make it cool again.
I mean, I think it's pretty cool, and there's lots of different types of network admins, right? Like I remember going back to maybe like late 2000s, I was working at TomTom in Amsterdam, the sort of European Garmin guys. I had some friends in IT, right? And some of them were provisioning VMs, but also fixing printers, right? And like going to check on like a switch in an office somewhere. Like this changed a lot. I think like that sort of IT role got very specialized. You're either like a cloud person or you're kind of premises person or something else. And I think that'll probably happen for network engineers as well. You'll be on the automation side, or you'll be in the data center, or you'll be doing something. especially in smaller companies where people tend to wear a lot of hats. I think as specialization happens, they'll wear less hats and people will go deeper on different areas.
Absolutely. So if you would design next gen source of truth from scratch today, what would you do differently, Basem?
For me, I prefer to have like really simple solutions. So for me, like a source of truth would be just a well designed Git repository, like no graphical user interfaces, no nothing. Just like have it just a Git repository, like well designed, very easy to create, like to write to and read from. That would be my preferred solution.
But Basem, one question. From which point would you start your journey? Is it inside of a network, or is it like, zero layer, but not?
It would start, I suppose, from like the intent itself, or like the life cycle. So like you have new devices coming in, so you assign them host names, you assign them like IP addresses, and then it goes from there. Like you apply your standards from there in terms of like the interfaces, if they're going to have BGP or OSPF and all that comes. But it just like starts from that life cycle.
And one question: how, let's say, companies? Well, not sure if it's the right question, but I'm sure you will get the point. Do companies suffer from managing the BGP? Mark.
Well, suffer depends on who you are. I think certainly we can guess that people have difficulties with BGP because there's so many little projects popping up all over the place to help them with that. But I mean, that's like saying, do people struggle with their virtualization? Yeah, some of them do. Some of them have, like Amazon's really nailed it. They're not worried about that anymore. So yeah, difficult question to answer.
Yeah, well, I mean, is it, let's say, let's compare DNS and BGP, which is like has more, where do you need more attention to? Is it DNS or is it BGP? Basem, from your experience, what do you see?
I'm a bit biased in this because I've always been involved more on the BGP side of things than DNS. DNS has always like mainly been with sysadmins. So from my experience, I've always been like more involved with BGP. And like to your question, I think there is like still struggle with BGP because a lot of work is still done manually, and still there is always fear that when you bring that neighbor up, is it gonna bring down the network? So I would say, like I think the struggle with BGP is still there, and I think there is a lot that automation can do here. Like you can do automated check to make sure that you're receiving the right number of routes, or to like select what routes you want to receive, and all these checks can be done automatically.
I'm actually would like to talk about some low-level things like RPKI. RPKI is a very beautiful thing to have, but as you actually based in Australia, Basem, perhaps you see some trends why so many telcos are not adopting RPKI to their networks, because what we see that it's only single-digit percentages of telcos that even think about the RPKI.
I think people or organizations are generally just like too busy too busy to kind of like keep up with the changes that are happening. And I think security is generally like one of those things that you don't get the consequences of it immediately, so it kind of like goes down kind of like in the backlog.
Thanks, Basem. What do you see from your side, Mark, regarding RPKI, or is it out of your scope for working with your customers?
It's not out of scope, but I just don't come across it a lot. I mean, one of the things is that like we have many customers, but we have many more open source users, and one of the problems with an open source community is you don't know exactly what they're doing. Right? Like sometimes they
Right.
tell you, but most of the time they don't. I would agree with Basem. Like, RPKI has been out there for a while. I think people are also generally concerned about like BGP security authentication kind of stuff, but companies move slowly, right? And I think telcos have often a lot of legacy. You mentioned earlier that acquisitions can make things difficult, and telcos in particular have consolidated a lot. So many of them are still dealing with, large acquisitions that they've made even a decade ago and newer ones recently. I think probably RPKI is just further down their to-do list, if I had to guess.
Makes sense. Makes sense. Right. So, guys, our time is almost finished, and we got one of the questions. Let me read it. Romuta Varnalita is asking, looking ahead to next year, what changes do you expect to see in network automation, and what interesting projects are you currently working on in this area? Mark.
What do I expect to see? Well, I mean, I think the thing to think about with network automation is the sort of Gartner hype cycle curve that we always see, right? So it's at like peak hype now, and that's good because it's getting a lot of attention and people are investing in it and everything else. Typically, what people do, this is also relevant for AI, is overestimate the impact of the technology in the short term, but underestimate it in the long term. So I think we're going to spend the next year seeing more and more and more investment going into automation. I think if you're not familiar with the Network Automation Forum and their AutoCon events, you should definitely go and check out those because they're fantastic and they're kind of generally where this conversation is happening right now. But I think ultimately we're going to come to the conclusion, like we did with DevOps, that a bunch of software engineers are going to learn how to network, and a bunch of network people are going to learn how to software engineer a little bit and move it from there. And I think what we still haven't really got to yet is like a full crossing of the chasm. Like there are a lot of success stories out there, but they're not all quite open in the open yet. And I expect to see more big logos talking about those next year. What interesting projects are you currently working on? A ton of them. Obviously, discovery and assurance remains top priority for us. We're doing a lot of stuff with AI, like I mentioned. One of the things I'm really interested in the moment, and Basem touched on this earlier, is once you have a good grasp on what's in your network, you can often infer what you could test about your network from that. And that's one of the areas that I'm personally very excited about.
Basem, what about you? And what
Yeah,
do you see?
Yeah, I think definitely like with all the hype with AI, we're gonna see like a lot more, or at least like from our end, and that's like one of the things I'm actively like working on is how to really integrate LLMs in a beneficial way into like our like workflows more than just the coding. The coding has been there for a while and it's always been assisting in developing the code, but like how do we integrate LLMs in a, I suppose one of the challenges for AI is how to do it in a safe and secure way. And so how do you, like most organizations are reluctant to send their data outside their premises. So one of the things that we're currently working on is how to use open source large language models and to see how that can be integrated into workflows. So things like how do you integrate it just to do a bit of like log analytics, so that kind of like saves the engineer, like it's still validated by humans, so it just like ingest logs, maybe gives you like a shortcut to say, oh, I think the issue is there, and then you as the engineer you go there. Or it could also, if you have access to just like show commands on your routers, and you can, let's say like do these show commands, can actually go and show you, okay, gives you like a shortcut or like saves you like 1 hour or 2 hours when troubleshooting an issue. So those are the kind of things that like currently I'm working towards in next year as well.
Sounds good. One more question from my side, guys, and perhaps we definitely are not gonna answer it but at least we can reflect a little on the things. Ultimately, we all want to see the networks automated, and so that we could speak with each other, their own language, right? Uh, sort of. The standards are still not there. There are multiple orchestrators, there are multiple applications, and we also have business-driven decisions that sometimes do not align with the engineers. So, what would be your ultimate suggestion on, for small companies to the, large ones, how we should start their SOT and automation journey today, Basem?
Yeah, just start with like the smallest project that you can have that would give the maximum outcome tied to the business goals. I think that's if I sum it, it would be like in that sentence.
And perhaps we should also kind of assign the title who should engage in this thing. So do you think that's a CTO or some technical guys, or it's like even the upper level guys that should think and see the advantage in it? Bison?
Generally, it starts with most projects you kind of like start with a network engineer who knows a bit of coding and does not like manual tasks. So they start by doing things, it gets momentum, and then once that's proven, then it kind of like gets adopted from the CTOs. That's the way I see most like that's the way it goes in most organizations.
Mark, what's your take on that?
I agree with that. Yeah, I mean, I think we see that. We spoke about how this market is now starting to act a little bit more like software developers. And what I mean by that is a lot of bottoms up, right? Like there's a problem I see, I just want to solve it, which means I need access to tools and I need to be able to learn quickly, perhaps helped by AI and everything else. So I agree with small experiments. My other suggestion is, I remember the 2024 Network Automation Forum survey, like biggest things blocking you from proceeding with network automation. The top one was permission, right? Like permission from above. And
there you go.
And I think what people need to keep in mind is that just because you think that your automation idea is extremely cool, doesn't mean that it isn't very scary for someone else, right? So I think ROI is very important, but also risk is important. Like, what's the worst thing that can happen if we do this? And if you communicate those things up front, then you're likely to be talking more in the language of the people who are managing you.
Amen.
Amen.
Right. Guys, it was a really great conversation with you. And I really think that, this conversation would not make a huge impact, but at least, we get a few people to think about how they should automate, their routine managing the network. So thank you very much for today's conversation. I had Basem Al-Sabri from NetOmate and Mark Coleman from NetBox Labs. And what I would like to announce at the beginning of our webinar that Baltic North 2026 is kicking off next year on 23rd to 24th September. So go to balticnorth.org and register. Thank you very much, guys. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Cheers.
Bye-bye.
Bye.